You found out, didn't you? Her chuckle echoed from the darkness. It was our first night together. The touch of her skin felt oddly different. Seeing my startled retraction, she laughed. What's happening? I couldn't help my curiosity and asked. She narrowed her eyes at me. Her eyes, cat-like, predatory. Curiosity can be dangerous, she said, slowly revealing her skin. She was truly beautiful then. Even after a decade, I still remember. My name is John Adams. I had just turned 36 at the time. I worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company. Not to boast, but I was their top salesperson. My wife, Catherine, came from a popular family of practitioners. It was a marriage arranged by my father-in-law. Catherine, whom I met at the matchmaking event, seemed like a proper lady. I found no reason to refuse, and so we got married. The higher-ups in the company were pleased about this advantageous connection. It was quite the clue, earning me envy from my peers. After getting married, I threw myself into my work more than ever to drown out the noise. I didn't even imagine that someone who disliked my success was by my side. There are many employees at my level vying for promotions. There are even factions within the upper echelons that aren't visible on the surface. Success depended on standing out in terms of sales and the scale of hospitals I managed, and becoming favored by the influential faction in the upper management. But honestly, I wasn't interested in all that. I simply wanted to help patients through our products. It's not some noble idea. I had a sister who didn't survive childhood cancer. Today, there is a cure for that. She could have been saved. That's why I believe in the power of medicine. I think it's absolutely necessary for people's lives, and I've contributed to patients through it. I was proud of this job and truly loved it. My seemingly smooth sailing future suddenly became clouded. The much-anticipated new medicine, on which we spent a significant amount in development costs, was finally launched. My boss was enthusiastic about making our team the #1 in the nationwide sales of this. He emphasized its early adoption in the hospitals we were responsible for during our sales meetings. The hospitals I was in charge of within my team had the greatest influence. Doctors in this area are reluctant to use new medicine unless they are adopted in the hospitals I'm in charge of. However, there are some doctors who prefer to wait for a certain period before using new ones due to safety considerations. But my boss aggressively pushed sales to the doctors I was in charge of. Turns out, the chief of surgery in this hospital had a close relationship with my boss. I was in charge of the other departments, and my boss was in charge of the surgery department. It seemed like I was in charge, but we were sharing roles as suggested by my boss. My boss urged the chief of surgery to use the new medicine. At that time, frequent wining and dining by pharmaceutical companies was still common, and my boss often went drinking with the chief of surgery, using my entertainment budget. This new drug is a fantastic medication that can be effective even for patients who have not had enough effect with other drugs. Therefore, I really want patients who are struggling to consider using it. However, caution was required when using it. Most drugs have precautions for use. Especially for drugs where side effects are a concern, there can be patients who should absolutely not use them. Surprisingly, my boss did not promote the appropriate use, which could be called the most important mission. As a result, the chief of surgery prescribed the drug to a patient who should never have taken it. The patient suffered from severe side effects. It was a serious incident that went unnoticed in the pharmacy department. I rushed to the hospital as soon as the side effect report came in and collected detailed information after hearing about the case. I was in shock. The patient was someone who should never have been administered the drug, and the prescribing doctor claimed not to have known. I deeply regretted sharing responsibilities with my boss. My boss went pale. This became a major issue within the company. And then, my boss pushed everything onto me. In fact, my name is the one listed as the person in charge of the hospital internally. I followed my boss's instructions to handle the expense reports for the entertainment costs. I was called in by the executives and confronted with documents and receipts. Receipts from lounges and restaurants that I never visited but processed. No matter how many times I explained the situation, the overwhelming amount of evidence made it hard to convince them. My boss was sitting next to the executives, looking smug. However, I knew that it was all a bluff. His trembling fingertips gave him away. I've seen the ugly side of humanity, and I was suddenly sick of the life tied to achievement figures. Facing the accusing executives, I told them that everything was done on my own accord. I declared that I would take responsibility and resign. The room went silent at my forthright demeanor. I wondered if my boss would try to keep me, but he didn't, and I easily quit my job. I had some savings, and I figured I'd manage somehow. That's what I thought. When I got home, Catherine greeted me with a fury in her eyes. Apparently, my father-in-law already contacted her. She reproached me for quitting my job right at the doorstep. She had some documents clenched in her hand. I could instantly guess it was divorce papers. There was something almost laughably meticulous about it. She was ready to part ways swiftly with a husband who no longer held any value. I guess she'd taken some advice from her dad. Everything felt like such a hassle, so I just signed the divorce papers on the spot. The house was a gift to Catherine from her father. I'll let you know once I decide where I'm going. I left those words behind as I left our home. I knew I wouldn't be coming back, but surprisingly, I didn't feel a trace of regret. If Catherine had shown even a slight hesitation to take the divorce papers, I might have ended up begging her in tears. But Catherine took the divorce papers aggressively, looking at me as if I were trash. All she needed from me was my income and my status. Knowing this, I felt a sense of ironic humor. From the next day, I started looking for a place to live. Being jobless, it was hard to find a realtor who would accommodate me. Even with my income certificate, they were cold to an unemployed man. I was in a tight spot. I decided to ask for help from an old friend. I remembered him working in the real estate industry. My friend was surprised by my situation and amazed at my current state. While dumbfounded, he chuckled, saying, "You've always been like this, haven't you?" He asked me to wait for 3 minutes, and right on the dot, he called back. He'd found an apartment and told me to come immediately. In a hurry, I noted the address and hung up. Following the noted address, I arrived at an old-fashioned Western-styled apartment. The apartment was retro-styled, with one entrance. It seemed rooms were scattered with a corridor in between. There were mailboxes marked with room numbers at the entrance. My friend had mentioned there was a landlord I should talk to. "Excuse me," I called out, as there was no doorbell. I heard the patter of footsteps from the end of the corridor. The person who appeared was a young woman. Her long black hair and porcelain-like white skin were striking. "Oh, are you John? I've heard about you. I'm the landlord, Nancy Thompson. Nice to meet you," she said, offering her right hand. Taken aback, I shook her cool hand. Her wrists and fingers were slender. I was surprised to find myself reluctant to let go of the handshake. Her name was Nancy Thompson. The other people called her Nancy. This apartment that's been converted into apartments is exclusively occupied by women, they told me. There's no need for any deposit or broker's fee, but they ask for my help with the heavy lifting. When I agreed to help out if I could, Nancy said with a laugh, "Well then, consider our deal done." "John, I heard you used to work for a pharmaceutical company," she remarked, offering me the keys. She must have heard from a mutual friend. Yes, I did. I worked there for many years but recently resigned. When I admitted that I was hit with a divorce as soon as I quit my job, Nancy burst into laughter. She seemed genuinely surprised when I confessed that I left my house right after that. "Well, there's nothing wrong with starting over," she said, her smile dazzling me. She seemed unbothered when I promised to find work quickly. And so, my new life began. There were a variety of tenants in these apartments. Students, novelists, and single mothers. There was even a mother who was escaping from an abusive husband. They all seemed to rely on me, which had me shaking with fear, as I lacked confidence in physical strength. They were all amiable people who brushed off my divorce with laughter. I started to learn more about Nancy. She was a 30-year-old widow who had outlived her husband. Apparently, she took over the apartment from her biological father. Her late husband had been a doctor. Small world. I felt like we might have just missed each other at some point. I started working part-time at a local bookstore. I considered getting a full-time job, but I wanted a part-time job that gave me more free time. There was quite a bit of physical labor required at the apartment, so I started doing some simple repairs on my days off. Nancy would occasionally share some of her dinner or bring me bread that she had baked as a hobby. The more we interacted, the more I found myself attracted to her. She casually helped out the other tenants in the apartment. The hallways were always clean, and despite the age of the apartment, it was comfortable living there. She even seemed to help the children of the single mothers with their homework from time to time. Just as I was drawn to her, she seemed to show an interest in me. She asked me about my previous job and often stopped by the bookstore where I worked part-time. It didn't take us long to start having dinner together. As we closed the gap between us, I found myself touching her skin for the first time in the darkness when I stayed at her place for the first time. She looked even more alluring than usual, so stunning that it took my breath away. Her skin was as cool as when I touched her hand that day. There was a strange sensation in her skin, and I instinctively pulled my hand back. Her skin felt too different to be human. Nancy stared at me as I pulled my hand back. Seeing my surprise, she laughed a little. "Sorry, what's going on?" In my flustered state, I lost all my older man's composure and asked her. She just narrowed her eyes and smiled. "Curiosity kills, you know. Are you sure you won't regret this?" She stared me down with eyes as fierce as a wild feline, revealing her skin to me. Upon it, a multitude of surgical scars remained. It must have been a significant injury. The marks on her pale skin almost resembled a flower pattern. The shocking severity of the scars I was seeing for the first time left me speechless, and she peered into my face with a hint of amusement. "I told you you'd regret it, didn't I? You can't touch me." She slowly pointed towards the exit. "Leave this room and regret hurting me." She expelled me from the bed with a cold voice I had never heard before. "What about those scars? Why?" I asked, and Nancy just laughed. Then she began to speak quietly. Nancy's husband used to work as a surgeon at a general hospital. Apparently, he had been unable to perform a surgery that he was supposed to because he was suspected of collusion with a pharmaceutical company. The patient died during the surgery performed by a substitute doctor. Of course, her husband had no involvement with the pharmaceutical company. It was the head of the surgery department who had pinned the blame on him. Taking all responsibility, her husband had to leave his job. After leaving the hospital, he was always down. When he said he was going to go on a hike, which was his hobby, Nancy was relieved. It was winter, but she sent off her experienced husband. That was the last time she saw him alive. He didn't return even after his scheduled descent. After a search, he was found dead in a snow cave. There was no suicide note. Did he go to the snow-capped mountain to end his life, or was it the result of an accident? Feeling responsible for not stopping him, Nancy threw herself off a cliff, apparently trying to follow him. Fortunately, she survived, but with significant scars left on her body. You can't mean the pharmaceutical company is. I had a gut feeling, and my words got stuck in my throat. I heard about a scandal caused by a senior colleague from my boss. That's right. It's the company where you work. They refused my husband, who had asked them many times to prove his innocence. Nancy said with a strained voice. She knew very well that I had nothing to do with it. But she said she despised me just for hearing that I worked in sales for that company. I thought it's okay for you to get hurt with something you can never have. Nancy said and laughed. She was laughing, but to me, it looked like she was crying. She knew she was being unreasonable. Yet, she still wanted to hurt me, regardless of the logic. Her feelings must have been strong. Nancy still has her deceased husband in her heart. She intends to live on, carrying his regrets. I shudder. Did Nancy draw my attention just for this? I wanted to believe that there were some feelings for me, if only a little bit, otherwise. Thanks for everything so far. I'm leaving tomorrow. I can't stay in this apartment any longer. I decided to leave tomorrow. I took a little break during my long life. My days in the apartment were such peaceful days. That would help if you could do that. I had a slight hope that she might stop me, but she wasn't that kind of person. She turned her back on me, not wanting to see my face anymore. She never looked at my face until the end. The next day, I rushed to the real estate agency from the morning and looked for a new apartment. This time I wasn't unemployed, so I managed to rent a place. I immediately started moving. I didn't have many belongings to begin with, so the move was easy. Once I leave this apartment, I plan to look for a job. My break from life is over. I told them I would quit my bookstore part-time job a month in advance. There's no going back now. I left the apartment as the neighbors saw me off. Since Nancy didn't show her face until the end, I left the keys with one of the tenants. I left a note of thanks for their kindness and decided to leave it with the keys. I wonder if Nancy will read my message. She probably won't read it. I had a feeling. A month later, I found a new job. It's the same sales job as before. I'm selling real estate. I ended up getting a job at that real estate agency. Although I'm learning a lot in a field that's new to me, I'm enjoying every day. And finally, today, I managed to move. My new place is that old apartment building. I've come back to that familiar apartment. I wondered what kind of face you'd make when you came back. Nancy was waiting for me at the entrance, arms crossed. Despite her harsh words, her eyes were calm. I'd like to start over. At my words, Nancy laughed as if she was dumbfounded. When I suggested that we start with introducing ourselves, Nancy wouldn't play along, saying it was silly. After asking a few times, she finally agreed. Even if we start over, It might be the same. If so, we'll start over again." As I responded nonchalantly, Nancy gave a wry smile. "I hope that when she finally sorts things out, I'll be right next to her. If she chooses someone else, I will say congratulations to her with all the bravado I can muster." How did you like it? Your subscription to our channel will motivate us. See you in the next video.